Lonely Mountain Man found a blonde woman hanging on the roof with Apache lover burned on her skin. Arizona Territory, 1876. A land carved by wind, blood, and silence. Between the jagged Sierra peaks and the red Apache trails lies Rust Creek, a dying mining town forgotten by maps and mercy. The air tastes of dust and gunpowder, and the nights carry whispers of things better left buried. On the mountain's edge lives Elias Boone, a 36-year-old trapper known only as the Ghost of Rust Creek. He speaks little, smiles never, and the townsfolk say he's seen too much to fear anything anymore. But that October evening, as the sun sank behind the cliffs and the coyotes began to sing, something in the wind changed. Smoke curled above the ridge, thin, gray, and strange. Elias felt it before he saw it. A chill that didn't belong to the cold. What he found beyond that ridge would shatter the silence of Rust Creek forever. The wind grew sharper as Elias followed the thin ribbon of smoke curling through the gray sky, each step crunching against the frozen dirt. The mountain had gone quiet, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. He moved through the pines, his coat brushing against dry branches, his eyes locked on the faint glow ahead. The old cabin stood crooked on the ridge, its roof half collapsed, windows broken like hollow eyes staring into the dark. The smoke drifted from a small fire still burning inside, though no one seemed to tend it. Elias hesitated, his instincts whispering that something was wrong, deeply wrong, but curiosity and duty pushed him forward. The door groaned as he nudged it open, and the air inside struck him cold. Then he saw her. A woman, blonde, no more than 27, hung from the roof beam, her hair tangled, her body still swaying slightly from the wind that slipped through the cracks. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing pale skin and open eyes that seemed to beg for an answer even in death. His chest tightened as he noticed the burn marks carved into her flesh. The cruel words, Apache lover, scorched deep across her collarbone. Elias froze, unable to move, his breath trembling in the silence. He stepped closer, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots, and saw a small silver locket dangling from her hand, catching the fire's weak glow. He gently reached out and took it, his fingers brushing against her cold skin. Inside the locket were two portraits, one of the woman herself and another of a man wearing the traditional beads of an Apache warrior. A faint memory stirred in his mind. He had seen that face before, years ago, when the peace between settlers and the Apache still held. He whispered a name he hadn't spoken in years, but the sound of it broke in his throat. Elias's heart pounded as he realized the message burned into her was not just hatred, but a warning. Someone wanted her story erased. Someone wanted silence. He looked around the cabin and saw signs of struggle. Broken glass, torn cloth, footprints stamped into the ash. The smell of smoke mixed with blood and something else. Something metallic that made him sick. A gust of wind blew through, and the door slammed shut behind him, jolting him back to the moment. He turned quickly, his hand on his revolver, but there was no one there. Only the whisper of the fire dying slow. The world outside felt distant, as if the mountain itself was listening. He took one last look at her, memorizing her face, then stepped out into the cold night. The stars above were dim, the kind of sky that made a man feel like he'd crossed into a place where God had forgotten to look. Elias knew this wasn't over. Whatever killed her wasn't finished. And somewhere in the dark, something was waiting for him to find it. Elias stood in the bitter wind, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the locket over under the pale moonlight. The metal felt strangely warm, as if it still carried her last breath. He flipped it open again, his rough fingers tracing the edges of the tiny portraits inside. On one side, the woman's soft features stared back at him, her smile faint and distant, captured before her world fell apart. On the other side, the face of an Apache warrior looked calm yet fierce, his eyes filled with quiet strength. Elias's stomach tightened. He knew that man. Years ago, during the border wars, he had fought beside the Apache for a short season when survival was all that mattered. The warrior's name had been Taza, a man who believed peace could exist between blood and dust. Seeing that face now twisted Elias's gut, because this death was not random, not the work of outlaws or drifters. It was a message burned in pain and sent through silence. He looked back toward the cabin, the broken door still swinging in the cold air. His mind replayed the image of her body hanging there, and a deep unease settled over him like a shadow he couldn't shake off. He could almost hear her voice, or maybe it was just the wind slipping through the trees, whispering something he couldn't understand. He closed the locket and slipped it into his pocket, feeling the weight of guilt press hard against his chest. He had left those mountains years ago, swearing never to return, but the ghosts had followed him anyway. The snow began to fall, thin flakes drifting through the moonlight, landing softly on his coat as if the mountain was trying to bury the truth before dawn. Elias knew someone wanted this woman forgotten, her love erased from the world. But whoever burned those words into her skin wanted everyone to see what happens when hearts cross forbidden lines. He stared down the slope, toward the flickering lights of Rust Creek in the distance, and felt the pull of something darker waiting there. The sheriff would have to hear about this, though Elias doubted the law would care. In a place like Rust Creek, justice was only for the living. He turned away from the cabin, his boots sinking into the frost, every step heavier than the last. The forest around him whispered his name, soft and broken, like it remembered his sins. He touched the locket once more, his thumb brushing the outline of Taza's face, and for a moment he felt the old bond, the kind forged not by loyalty, but by shared scars. He wondered if Taza knew what had happened, or if this was only the beginning of something far worse. The wind howled again, carrying a sound that made Elias stop mid-step. It wasn't an animal, not the night's echo. It was a cry, faint and distant, coming from somewhere beyond the ridge, and it carried the same pain that lived in that locket. The morning came cold and gray as Elias rode into Rust Creek, the locket heavy in his pocket, and the weight of the night pressing hard on his mind. The town looked half dead, wooden signs creaking in the wind, shutters clapping weakly against walls that hadn't seen paint in years. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office, dusted the frost from his coat, and stepped inside. Sheriff Clay Rowan sat behind his desk, boots on the table, coffee steaming beside a stack of old ledgers. His eyes lifted slowly when Elias entered, the same lazy squint of a man who'd seen too much and cared too little. Elias told him everything, his voice steady but cold, describing the cabin, the woman. The words burned into her skin. The sheriff didn't flinch, didn't even blink. When Elias finished, the room fell silent except for the ticking of a broken clock on the wall. Then Rowan leaned forward, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots, and said in a flat voice that there was no record of any woman fitting that description. No Claire Dalton, no missing settler, no one reported gone. Elias frowned, his jaw tightening. He knew what he'd seen, and the sheriff's calm denial sounded too smooth, too rehearsed. Rowan leaned back and tapped the brim of his hat. "Best you forget it, Boone," he said. "Some things up in those hills are better left where they hang." His tone carried something sharp beneath it, a warning wrapped in false kindness. Elias felt his pulse rise, the old fire in his chest flickering alive. He asked about the Apache connection, about the man in the locket, but Rowan's eyes hardened and his hand drifted toward the rifle leaning against the wall. The message was clear: leave it. Elias stood still for a long moment, the air between them heavy with unspoken truth. Then he nodded once and turned to go, but as he opened the door, Rowan called after him, voice low and rough. "You start stirring ghosts, Boone. They'll come looking for you too." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the dry rattle of tumbleweeds down the empty street. Elias walked past the saloon, past the church, every face that watched him seeming to know something he didn't. The world felt smaller now, as if the whole town shared a secret they'd buried deep under dust and fear. He stopped at the edge of the road, pulled the locket from his pocket, and stared at the faces inside once more. The woman's eyes seemed sadder now, the warrior's expression more distant, like they were fading into memory. Elias closed it gently and whispered a promise only the wind could hear. He would not forget. He would not look away. Somewhere behind those calm lies and empty smiles, the truth was waiting, and he could already feel it moving toward him, slow and dangerous, like thunder rolling over the desert hills. That night the town slept under a sky so still it felt carved from stone. But Elias couldn't rest. The sheriff's words kept echoing in his head like the last notes of a dying song. He sat alone in his cabin, the firelight flickering across the locket as he turned it over again and again, searching for meaning in the quiet. He knew lies when he heard them, and Clay Rowan's calm voice had been nothing but a curtain-hiding rot. The next morning, Elias rode out before sunrise, following the trail of whispers that the townsfolk tried to bury. He visited the church first, where the old records were kept, their pages yellowed and brittle. It was there he found her name written faintly in the corner of an old ledger. Claire Dalton, daughter of Thomas Dalton, one of the first settlers who carved Rust Creek out of stone and fear. The last entry beside her name was crossed out with thick ink, but the word underneath was still visible. Missing. Elias stared at it for a long time before closing the book and slipping it back into place. Outside, a woman sweeping the steps glanced at him with wide eyes, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. When he asked about Claire, her hands shook. "Don't," she whispered. "They'll hear you." That was enough to tell him everything. The people of Rust Creek weren't protecting her memory. They were hiding what they had done. Elias rode to the edge of town, toward the canyons where the Apache once camped, hoping someone there still remembered her. By midday, he found an old scout near the dried riverbed, a man named Jonah Pike who had traded once with both sides. Jonah's face tightened when Elias mentioned Claire's name. She loved him, he said quietly. Loved an Apache like he was her own kin. His name was Taza. Elias listened as Jonah told the story in a cracked voice, the way Claire would sneak out at night, how she brought food to the tribe when the settlers starved them, how her father begged her to stop but she never did. When the town discovered her secret, they called her a traitor, accused her of giving supplies to the enemy. The Apaches never touched her. It was her own people who took her away one night and made sure no one spoke of her again. Elias felt his throat close, anger rising like fire behind his ribs. All this time they had blamed the tribe, painted them as savages, while the real cruelty was born in their own streets. He looked toward the mountains where the smoke once rose and made his choice. He would find Taza, the only man who might know the truth of how Claire died. The air grew colder as he rode toward the fading sun, dust swirling behind his horse like ghosts chasing his shadow. Each mile carried him closer to the truth and deeper into the kind of war that never truly ends. The storm came without warning, roaring across the canyon like the sky itself had split open, and through the rain Elias saw a lone figure waiting by the fire line, still and proud against the flames. It was Taza, his eyes burning with grief and quiet strength. He told Elias that Claire had died trying to keep both sides from killing each other, that her last words were a plea for peace no one wanted to hear. Lightning cracked above them, and for a moment the world stood still as two men from different worlds shared the same loss. When the storm eased, Elias carried Claire's body back to the mountain and buried her beneath the same cold moon that had watched her die. As dawn touched the ridge, he placed a wooden cross at her grave, carved one word into it, and whispered it to the wind before he rode away: "Forgiven."